Hello, everyone. Today, I'm going to tell you a story filled with mystery, suspense, and an eerie sense of the unknown. A story about justice, darkness, and things beyond our understanding. Imagine yourself walking down an old, desolate street where thick fog blankets the path and the streetlights flicker weakly, as if they're afraid of something lurking in the shadows. A cold gust of wind rushes past, carrying whispers from the unseen, sending a chilling sensation down your spine, as if someone or something is watching you. And it is here, in this very place, that our story begins. Brace yourself, because what you're about to hear is not for the faint of heart. Hit like, share, and follow to make sure you don't miss the next thrilling story. Now, let's step into the darkness. The night hung heavy over the old, abandoned street, its silence pierced only by the distant echoes of a howling wind. Fog slithered like ghostly fingers through the narrow alleyways, curling around the flickering streetlights that struggled to stay alive. The air was thick with an unshakable sense of dread, as if the street itself was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to arrive. Margaret Lewis, an elderly woman wrapped in a dark, tattered cloak, moved slowly along the cracked pavement. Her silver hair peeked out from under her hood, and her frail hands clutched a wooden cane that tapped rhythmically against the damp ground. She had walked this street for over 50 years, but tonight felt different. The shadows seemed longer, the whispers in the wind louder. A sudden metallic clank echoed from the alley behind her. Margaret stopped, her breath hitching. She wasn't alone. The old woman turned her head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of a dark figure emerging from the mist. "Hey! Move it, old hag!" The voice was sharp, cutting through the eerie quiet like a blade. Officer Derek Marshall, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a navy blue uniform, stepped out of the fog, his boots stomping with an air of authority. His sharp, calculating eyes locked onto Margaret with an expression of disdain. Margaret didn't answer. She simply adjusted her hood, her fingers tightening around the handle of her cane. Marshall's face twisted into a sneer. "What's wrong? Too old to hear me. I said move." Still, Margaret didn't respond. Instead, she took another slow step forward, as if she hadn't heard him at all. Something flickered in Marshall's expression: anger, irritation, and a hint of something else: unease. He had harassed plenty of people before, but there was something about this old woman that felt off. The way she walked, the way the fog curled around her like it obeyed her, the way the street itself seemed to darken the closer he got to her. With a growl of frustration, Marshall lunged forward and shoved Margaret with all his strength. The moment his hands touched her, the temperature dropped violently. A gasp escaped his lips as a shock of cold pain shot through his arms, like he had grabbed a block of solid ice. He stumbled back, shaking his hands, as if trying to rid himself of an unseen force. Margaret finally lifted her head, her eyes meeting his for the first time, and what he saw sent a shiver down his spine. Her eyes weren't normal. They were deep, dark pools of endless blackness, swirling like a bottomless void, whispering, shifting, hungry. Marshall's breath hitched. He couldn't move. For the first time in his life, he felt afraid. A gust of wind howled through the street, and suddenly, the streetlights above them flickered violently, then died altogether. Total darkness. Then, a whisper. Not Margaret's voice. Something else. Something ancient. Something hungry. "He has touched the cursed one." Marshall's heart slammed against his ribs. The voice had come from right behind him, but there was no one there. The moment the streetlights blinked out, a suffocating silence fell over the street. Not a single sound, no wind, no footsteps, nothing. It was as if the entire world had paused, holding its breath, waiting for something unholy to make its move. Officer Derek Marshall's pulse pounded like a war drum. His fingers twitched toward the baton strapped to his belt, his instincts screaming at him to do something, but his body refused to move. He could still feel the unnatural chill lingering on his skin, seeping into his bones from where he had shoved Margaret Lewis just moments ago. She stood unmoving, her dark cloak billowing slightly, despite the air being completely still. But it wasn't just her stillness that sent a sliver of ice down Marshall's spine. It was her eyes. Those soulless, endless pits of swirling blackness, shifting like liquid shadow. Then came the whispers. At first they were faint, like the rustling of dead leaves in a forgotten graveyard. But within seconds, they grew louder, clearer, closer. Marshall's breath came in short, panicked gasps as he turned his head left, then right, searching for the source of the eerie voices. His fingers gripped his baton, sweat slicking his palms. The whispers slithered through the darkness, overlapping, repeating in a chorus of the damned. He touched the cursed one. He does not belong here. The street remembers. The street punishes. Marshall's eyes darted to the crowd, gathering along the sidewalks. At first he hadn't noticed them, but now something was terribly wrong. They weren't moving. The people, or whatever they were, stood frozen, their faces partially obscured by the swirling mist, their silhouettes barely distinguishable. Marshall's stomach twisted. The longer he stared, the more unnatural they seemed. A woman in a tattered red dress stood closest to him, her face turned slightly downward, her lips moving as if murmuring something. Marshall took a cautious step forward. "Hey!" His voice cracked, but he forced it out. "What the hell's wrong with you people?" No response, he swallowed hard. His radio. He needed to call for backup. His hands shot to his shoulder, fumbling for the radio, clipped to his uniform. He pressed the button, his voice shaking. "Dispatch, this is Officer Marshall. I need immediate backup on—" A sharp burst of static filled his earpiece, followed by a gut-wrenching, blood-curdling scream. The sound wasn't human. Marshall ripped the radio from his shoulder, nearly dropping it as the horrible wailing continued. High-pitched, distorted, filled with something between agony and rage. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the scream stopped. The radio cut to silence. Marshall's hands shook violently. He slowly lifted his gaze back toward the crowd, and his blood ran cold. The woman in the red dress had moved closer. Too close. Her face was now fully visible under the dim moonlight, and Marshall's stomach lurched. Her eyes were missing. Two gaping, empty sockets stared back at him, black as Margaret's. Her lips twisted into something that was almost a smile. Behind her, the entire crowd started moving, but not like normal people. Their heads twitched unnaturally, their bodies jerking as if they were being controlled by invisible strings. And then, they whispered in unison, "He will be taken." Marshall stumbled backward, pure terror gripping his body. His breath came in ragged gulps, his chest tightening as the air around him grew impossibly heavy. His instincts screamed at him to run, to get away, but his legs refused to obey. Margaret finally spoke, her voice low, ancient, and filled with something beyond human understanding. The street does not forget. Then, without warning, the shadows lunged for him. The darkness pulsed like a living thing, creeping toward Officer Marshall as the whispers grew into a deafening chant. His breath hitched, his mind screaming at him to move, fight, do something. But his limbs felt like they were weighed down by invisible chains. Then a sound cut through the madness, a sharp rhythmic tapping, footsteps, steady, purposeful. Someone was coming. From the far end of the street, Ethan Graves emerged from the fog, his silhouette cutting through the unnatural gloom. His presence alone disrupted the suffocating stillness, like a crack of thunder breaking a heavy silence. Ethan had been on his way home after a late-night training session, when he felt an unnatural chill crawl up his spine, something primal, something his instincts refused to ignore. Now, standing at the edge of the nightmare unfolding before him, he took in the scene, Marshall frozen in fear, the unmoving figures of the crowd, and the old woman who seemed almost untouched by it all. His gut told him one thing: this wasn't normal. Marshall's wild, panicked eyes snapped to Ethan, desperation flickering across his face. "Help!" he gasped, his voice hoarse. "Something's wrong. They're not—" Before he could finish, the air shifted. A wave of pressure slammed into Ethan, making his muscles lock up for a fraction of a second. It felt like the very street was pushing back against him, resisting his presence. Then, The whisper stopped. Silence. Complete, utter silence. Then, a low, gurgling growl echoed from the mist behind Marshall. Something else was here. Ethan didn't hesitate. His body moved on instinct, years of fighting experience taking over. He rushed forward, eyes locked on Marshall, who still stood paralyzed in terror. Move, Ethan barked, but the officer was rooted in place, his gaze fixed on something behind him. Ethan didn't have time to ask questions. With a powerful lunge, he grabbed Marshall by the shoulder, yanking him backward, just as a shadowy appendage burst from the darkness, slamming into the spot where Marshall had stood only a second ago. The impact sent shards of concrete flying, a deep gash splitting the pavement open. Ethan barely had time to register what he had just seen before a second tendril shot toward him. His instincts screamed. Duck! He dropped low, feeling the cold rush of air above his head as the shadowy limb sliced through the space where his neck had been. The thing, whatever it was hunting them. Marshall, now collapsed on the ground, clutched at his throat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Ethan stood in front of him, shoulders squared, every muscle in his body coiled like a predator ready to strike. He wasn't just fighting a man. He wasn't even sure he was fighting something human. Margaret, still standing untouched, let out a slow breath. You shouldn't have interfered, boy, she murmured, but her voice wasn't entirely hers anymore. It echoed, layered with something deeper, something wrong. Ethan didn't look away from the swirling shadows ahead. Yeah, well, you shouldn't have messed with me either. Then, the darkness lunged again. The darkness lunged, twisting and writhing like a living entity, its tendrils stretching toward Ethan with terrifying speed. Ethan's instincts kicked in. He rolled to the side, narrowly dodging the shadowy appendage as it slammed into the pavement, sending cracks spiderwebbing through the ground. The impact shook the street, dust and shattered asphalt, flying into the air. From behind him, Marshall let out a strangled gasp, still struggling to get his footing. His face was ashen, his body trembling from whatever unnatural force had gripped him moments ago. But Ethan couldn't focus on the terrified cop, not when something was actively trying to kill him. Another tendril of darkness snapped toward him. This time, he was ready. With lightning-fast reflexes, Ethan caught the tendril mid-strike, gripping the swirling mass of shadows with his bare hands. It felt wrong, like grabbing onto something that wasn't entirely there, cold, wet, and pulsing like a beating heart. A violent shock shot up his arm, searing into his nerves, but he held on, gritting his teeth as he twisted the tendril and yanked it to the side. The entity shrieked. It was an unnatural, inhuman sound, a combination of metal scraping, wind howling, and distant, tortured wails. The air around them seemed to tremble in response. Ethan's mind raced. He had fought some of the best fighters in the world, but this wasn't something that could be taken down with strength alone. He needed to find its weakness. Margaret, still standing in the middle of the chaos, tilted her head ever so slightly. The movement was unnatural, too smooth, too calculated. Her empty, swirling black eyes focused on Ethan, and for the first time, a sliver of amusement crossed her otherwise impassive face. You fight well, boy, she murmured, but you do not understand what you're up against. Ethan clenched his jaw. Try me. With a surge of strength, he ripped the tendril free from his grip and lunged forward, his fist glowing faintly with the energy radiating off the creature. He didn't know how, but he could feel something, some sort of force pushing back against the darkness. Maybe it was just adrenaline. Maybe it was something else. Either way, he wasn't about to let it win. He swung. His fist collided with the swirling mass of shadows, and the second it made contact, the street cracked open. A blinding shockwave erupted, splitting the air apart with a deafening boom. The entire street shuddered, and for the first time, the darkness recoiled. Ethan staggered back, his pulse hammering in his ears. The shadowy tendrils began to dissolve, shrinking into the mist that still clung to the street. It was working. Margaret's smile faltered. Her black eyes flickered, her expression twisting from amusement to something else. Concern. Ethan caught it. Not so confident now, huh? Her lips parted slightly, and when she spoke, her voice was layered again. But this time, it wasn't just her speaking. It was many voices, overlapping, whispering, screaming. You do not belong here. This is not your fight. Leave while you still can. Ethan refused to back down. The air shifted again, and he felt it before he saw it. Another presence. Something older, angrier, and much more powerful was beginning to wake. And it wasn't happy. From behind him, Marshall let out a choked sob, his knees buckling. "Well, what the hell is this?" he stammered, eyes darting around wildly. Ethan didn't answer, because he didn't know. All he knew was that this wasn't over. Not yet. And whatever was coming next, it was going to be worse. The air thickened, growing heavier, as if the street itself had become a living entity, watching, waiting, ready to pass judgment. Ethan's heartbeat thundered in his ears, his instincts screaming at him to brace for impact. Then, it came. A violent tremor split through the street, the pavement cracking like shattered glass beneath Ethan's feet. The shadows didn't just move this time, they attacked. From every corner of the cursed street, tendrils of darkness shot forward, writhing and twisting like a mass of vengeful spirits. The whispers returned, louder, more guttural, no longer just voices but screams, agonized, enraged, demanding retribution. He does not belong. He must pay. The street remembers. Ethan reacted on pure instinct, twisting his body as one of the tendrils sliced toward his chest. He barely dodged in time, the air around it icy and suffocating, stealing the warmth from his skin as it passed. Marshall, still on his hands and knees, let out a strangled cry, his face contorted with terror, his breath ragged. "Make it stop!" he bellowed, eyes darting wildly. Ethan had no time for him. Another shadow lashed out, aiming straight for his throat. Ethan ducked, rolled, then sprang back up, slamming his fist into the swirling darkness. A burst of energy erupted from his strike, forcing the tendril backward. But it wasn't enough. More shadows came. Dozens. Hundreds. They swarmed, twisting together into a colossal mass of darkness, forming a towering figure, a humanoid shape with glowing white eyes, soulless and piercing. Its form shifted constantly, as if reality itself couldn't decide what it was. And then it spoke. Not in a single voice, but in a chorus of overlapping whispers, deep and haunting. "You should not have interfered, warrior." Ethan clenched his fists. His body was burning with energy, but he could feel it, the weight of this thing. Whatever it was ancient, powerful, and full of rage. Margaret, still standing motionless, finally let out a breath. "You brought this on yourself, boy," she murmured. Her voice was layered, inhuman, echoing as if multiple entities spoke through her at once. Ethan's grip tightened. "Yeah? Well, so did you." Then he charged. His muscles coiled as he sprinted forward, dodging as the giant shadow figure swung its massive arm down at him. The force of the attack shattered the pavement, sending rubble flying. Ethan launched himself into the air, twisting mid-jump, and delivered a devastating spinning kick to the shadow's chest. The impact sent a shockwave rippling through the entity, its form distorting and crackling like static. It let out a screech that shook the entire street. Margaret's smile finally vanished. Marshall cowered, watching in horror as Ethan landed gracefully, his stance firm. But the shadow wasn't finished. The figure's massive arms stretched outward, and suddenly, the entire street bent inward, as if reality itself was being crushed. Ethan's vision blurred. His ears rang with unearthly sounds, the whispers now deafening, drilling into his skull. Enough! The command was final, absolute, unquestionable. And just like that, everything stopped. The shadows froze in place. The figure began to disintegrate, the darkness retreating, unraveling as if it had been forcibly dismissed. Margaret's body stiffened, her mouth slightly agape. Then she collapsed. The air shifted, and suddenly it was silent again. The fog began to thin, the suffocating pressure lifting off the street. The figures in the crowd, the ones who had never moved, began to fade. One by one, they vanished, dissolving into the mist like forgotten echoes. Marshall let out a shaky breath, his face drenched in sweat. He turned his gaze to Ethan, his voice weak, trembling. What was that? Ethan exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. He could still feel the energy coursing through his veins. But the battle was over, at least for now. Something that doesn't belong in our world, he muttered, and something tells me it's not the only one. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away into the fading mist, leaving Marshall to sit alone in the wreckage of a nightmare that would haunt him forever. The street was eerily silent, the air thick with the fading remnants of whatever unholy presence had just been banished. The mist still lingered, swirling lazily around the cracked pavement, but the oppressive weight, the ancient rage that had gripped the air, was gone. Ethan stood still, his fists clenched, his breath slow and controlled. His entire body ached, every muscle in him screaming from the battle. He could still feel the echoes of the energy that had surged through him, something more than adrenaline, something not entirely human. And yet, he was still here. Officer Marshall, still hunched on the ground, let out a ragged gasp, his hands clutching his own throat like he had nearly been suffocated. His uniform was soaked in sweat, his face ashen and hollow. He turned his bloodshot eyes toward Ethan, his voice barely above a whisper. What the hell just happened? Ethan didn't answer, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know. Instead, he turned to where Margaret Lewis had fallen. She lay motionless on the cold pavement, her black cloak spread around her like a shroud, but there was something wrong. Too still, too empty. Slowly, cautiously, Ethan approached her, his boots crunching over the rubble. Something about her felt different now. Then, her eyes snapped open, but they were no longer the abyssal void of shadows. They were just eyes, human, aged, mortal. She gasped, her frail hands gripping the fabric of her cloak like she was waking from a long nightmare. Ethan knelt beside her. Are you? He asked carefully. Margaret blinked, confusion flickering across her face. Then, a single tear slid down her cheek. It's gone, she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, fragile. Nothing like the ethereal, layered echoes it had been before. After all these years, it's finally gone. Ethan frowned. What was it? Margaret shuddered. The street, it remembers. It always has. It was never just a place. It's something older, darker. It punishes those it deems unworthy. She turned her weary gaze to Marshall, who flinched as if struck. And you, boy, you were marked. Marshall shook his head. His voice barely controlled hysteria. I didn't do anything, he stammered. I just pushed you. That's not... Margaret cut him off with a hollow chuckle. Her eyes filled with something Ethan couldn't quite place. You think this was about tonight? She murmured. No. The street was watching long before that. Marshall's breath hitched. His lips parted as if to argue, but the words died in his throat. Ethan exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. So, it's over? Margaret looked at him. The silence stretched. Then, she said softly, for me? Yes, but not for him. The words barely left her lips when the wind shifted. The mist curled unnaturally as if something unseen had stirred. A low whisper crept through the air, faint but unmistakable. He does not belong. Ethan's blood ran cold. He turned to Marshall and immediately knew. The street hadn't forgotten him, and it wasn't done with him. Marshall jerked violently, as if an unseen force had just grabbed his body. His breath came out in strangled gasps, his fingers clawing at his own uniform. No, no, he choked out. But there was nothing there, nothing anyone could see. But something was there. The street had decided, and its judgment was final. Marshall's body began to sink. Not into the ground, not into the mist. Into something else entirely. His legs disappeared first, dissolving into the air like sand, slipping through invisible fingers. His screams pierced the night, raw and guttural, echoing through the empty street. Ethan's heart pounded. He lunged forward, grabbing Marshall's wrist, but his hand passed straight through him. Marshall's eyes, wide, wild with panic, locked onto Ethan's. Help me, please, he begged. But there was nothing to grab. His chest vanished next. the mist swallowing him like an ocean pulling in a sinking corpse. His voice grew fainter. Then, only his face remained, his mouth frozen mid-scream. Before he was gone. Silence. Ethan stood rooted to the spot, his breath heavy. His fingers clenched into fists, but there was nothing to fight, nothing to stop. The street had taken what it came for, and it left no trace. The wind howled, and just like that, the world returned to normal. Margaret sighed, her frail hands trembling as she pulled herself up. "It's done," she whispered. Ethan let out a slow, shaky breath. What the hell was that? Margaret turned her tired eyes toward him. Justice. A deep shudder rolled through Ethan's body. He had fought men before. He had fought monsters in the cage. But this? This was something else entirely. And somehow, he knew. This wasn't the last time he would see something like it. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his boots echoing against the pavement. The mist swirled one last time before finally fading. The cursed street was silent again. For now.